Well, hello everyone and welcome. Whether you're here in person today or joining us online through the stream, welcome to this Computer History Museum here in the heart of Silicon Valley. We want to offer a warm welcome to all of you in our CHM Live program. This is a special program as part of our CHM Live series, which are educational programs on the issues of technology that matter to each of us in our lives every day, because as we all know, we are all digital citizens today. We have no choice. So thank you all for coming. I'm CEO of CHM. My name is Daniel Lewin. For those of you who I don't know, I see a number of familiar faces out there from long ago and far away, so thank you for coming. Like all cultural institutions, CHM's over the course of this last year has been dealing with these unprecedented times. And I'm grateful to our trustees, staff, members, supporters, and all who have allowed us to continue our operations through the pandemic. And not only just to survive, but actually just to really thrive. We've done quite a lot of new and interesting things that you'll see in the year to come, as well as this evening. Now, our mission as a museum is to decode technology, the computing past, where we have our agency, the digital present, and the future impact on the human condition, to shape a better future. You say, why would we do this? And in particular, in light of our mission and purpose, the Tech for Good program is one of the overarching programmatic areas within which we have been building our efforts over the last few years. And it's all because of the very statement that I made a moment ago: life doesn't exist without computing for all of us and virtually anyone that we would reach around the world. And so the fundamental question associated with that is, what does it mean to be human in a world that doesn't exist without computing? And so this program and the wonderful work that we've been able to accomplish with the support of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation over the last several years has allowed us to present this first prize for Tech for Good and for Humanity this year. So I'd like to welcome special guests from the McGovern Foundation who've been so helpful to us over the course of the last several years. And the leaders, the board members and staff that are here, Vilas Dar, Pat McGovern, Steve Verbinski, and Megan English. So thank you to the McGovern Foundation. And also, I'd like to extend a personal welcome and thank you to our Luminary Prize recipient, Sal Khan. I met Sal about 15 years ago, so I've had the pleasure of knowing him for quite some time over the growth of the Khan Academy and what he's done for the greater good of the world. When I met him, he was still working from his home office, and he actually had a small closet in one of the bedrooms where he was doing the work. So he was clearly anticipating where we were all going to be working for the last 2 years. So he's been a visionary all along. So we appreciate Saul and all you've done. So thank you for what you do. And now to introduce today's program, Marguerite Gong Hancock, who's the VP of Innovation and Programming at CHM. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks so much, Daniel, and welcome to each of you. I'm thrilled to add my warm welcome, especially in this pandemic time when it's difficult to get together. It's a special meaning to be here together in person. And for those of us who are joining virtually, a warm welcome to you as well. So today's program is a special chance for us to honor our luminary, Sal Khan, who's been recognized with the museum for his extraordinary impact in extending education access worldwide and in improving learning outcomes. So as we do that today, this is part of the museum's ongoing work in our collection, our content, programming, events, and education. In particular today, we hope that this conversation will open kind of a window into three aspects of Sal's impact. First, as an education pioneer. Second, as an entrepreneur who's lived quite a journey in what he started and continues to start. And third, the ways that he's used technology to create a better future for all of us, improving education worldwide. So along the way, you'll see some footage. We are a museum, and so we not only have this event here, but we have had the opportunity to interview Sal and actually the other people that we are honoring as part of this prize. So you'll see some of that footage. So as we continue CHM's tradition, I'd like to introduce Sal using 5 numbers. First, 1, high school budget, which is equivalent to Khan Academy's budget. 500 to 1, the social benefit to cost ratio for Khan Academy. 85 million learning minutes per day on Khan Academy during the pandemic. 50, the current language translation projects for Khan Academy education materials. And something about Sal personally, 30 minutes spent per day devoted to meditating. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Sal Khan. Sal, can you join us here? Glad you're here. Well, when we're thinking about who could engage in the conversation with Sal, we thought it would be really fun and fascinating to not have just one, but have 2 moderators. In the first segment, the fireside chat will focus on education. And what better moderator than an experienced learner on Khan Academy and a university student who's attending Sal's alma mater. So her name is Ananita Srinivasan. We're especially proud of her as an alumni also of our teen education programs here at CHM. In 2017, she joined our CHM volunteer internship program and returned in subsequent years to be on our teen engagement council and also to serve on our teen content team where she was creating content around AI and innovation for our teen audiences. Currently, she's an undergraduate at MIT, majoring in electrical engineering and computer science. Sound familiar? And she's conducted research at MIT's Kavli Institute of Astrophysics, using machine learning to classify the shapes of exoplanets, which she needed explained to me. And she hopes to continue her research in AI and machine learning in the future. She has a passion for Formula One racing because it combines engineering with sport. And so she's on MIT's motorsports team, where she's focused on developing software for their original Formula style race car that's going to be entering a competition this summer. So please join me in welcoming Anahita as moderator.
When I first set up Khan Academy as a not-for-profit, there's a part of the form with the IRS that says mission : and they give you about a line and a half. And I thought about it for about 30 seconds. And I wrote a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. And at the time, it was a very delusional thing to write down. It's arguably a delusional thing to write down even if you're a head of state, a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere, but especially if you're some guy in a walk-in closet who's a former hedge funder who's now trying to write some software and make some videos. But I did feel that if you're going to do something, you might as well swing for the fences.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me. I think I speak for the entire audience when I say it's a real pleasure, so thank you.
No, when I found out about your background, I want to learn about exoplanets and Formula One racing. This could go 2 ways, but anyway.
Oh, man.
Thank you for thanking me.
So from this clip, it's amazing to hear how you sort of decide on Khan Academy's mission statement. So for people like me who have used Khan Academy extensively, also for people who might not be as familiar, could you share your big ideas about how Khan Academy can help people learn?
Yeah, it's not a new idea. I think it was Steve Jobs who famously thought that computers could be treadmills for the mind. Isaac Asimov, who I'm a big fan of, once envisioned a future where every house would have a terminal that people could learn from. So it's a very, very old idea. And I think when Khan Academy was getting off the ground, a lot of folks know this started as back when I was an analyst at a hedge fund in Boston. My cousins needed tutoring. I started tutoring them remotely. One thing led to another. I started making software and videos for them, and people who weren't my cousins were using it. I did immediately start to say, hey, maybe we're at the right moment in history that something like this could become what Isaac Asimov envisioned or what Steve Jobs had envisioned. And so as it just got more and more traction, I just never let go of that dream. And I think there was 2 things that it was connected to. One was, going back to Isaac Asimov, the Foundation series is one of my favorite books. I first read it in middle school. I reread it every couple of years. And I'm not going to giving away the plot line, but in it, the protagonist is Harry Seldon. I think it's 30,000 years in the future. Humanity has colonized the galaxy. And this Harry Seldon, he's an academic who, he has a new field called psychohistory, which is a combination of math and economics and psychology, and he's able to predict large-scale historical movements using his math. And he sees that the Galactic Empire is about to enter into a 10,000-year dark ages. And he decides to do something about it. He can't stop it from happening, the math shows that, but he could shorten it to 1,000 years. And the way that he does it is he sets up a foundation at the periphery of the galaxy that has all of the galactic knowledge that can then stimulate kind of a renaissance through these dark ages. And I remember when I read that in 7th or 8th grade, thinking, wow, Harry Seldon or Isaac Asimov is right. It's so easy to get impressed with the civilization based on how tall their skyscrapers are, or how nice their roads are, or how impressive of an economy or military they have. But it really is all about what's going on in people's minds. And at the end of the day, how do you build that? That's all about education. If the right things are going on in people's minds, it doesn't matter if the pillars crumble, society's going to be all right. You could have great pillars, and if the wrong things are going on in people's minds, then you might not be all right. So that was always in the back of my mind. And also, I always found it inspiring, like, what if you can think more than your own life or your even a generation or multi-generations like Harry Seldon did. And then when I became an adult, and especially when I worked at a hedge fund, I realized not only do people not even think about multiple years, people seldom think beyond the next quarter for what's going to happen. So that was one data point where I kind of wanted to, as you all saw in the video, swing for the fences on the mission. And the other one, I have to give credit to MIT to a large degree, because I remember in I think it was 1999 or 2000, it was obvious to everyone back then that the internet could be a really good model for disseminating knowledge or even having online classes. It was obvious 20 years ago. And I remember a lot of universities were starting to do for-profit ventures and trying to some degree, monetize the internet. And I remember it was in 1999 or 2000, and at the time, I didn't think I had any real connection to education in my life. MIT announced the MIT Open Courseware Project. Yeah. And it was so counterintuitive to what you would expect from any institution at the time, where they just said, hey, the internet allows us to disseminate knowledge for close to zero marginal cost. There's some fixed cost of creating the knowledge and the materials. So we're just on our own dime going to give this away for free to the world. And I remember when I saw that press release, I was working at a startup in San Francisco at the time, being incredibly inspired. I think there's a lot of institutions that talk about teaching ethics and morals and all of this to the students, but very few times do you see large institutions take a stand like that. And so, you fast forward to 2004, 2005, 2008, 2009, when I quit my day job, I was inspired by both Harry Seldon and MIT's Open Courseware example to say, yeah, maybe this could be bigger than, a business or anything like that.
All right, no, sounds good. And I kind of want to tease out this MIT connection a little bit more, because I know at MIT you got 2 Bachelor of Science degrees, one in electrical engineering, computer science, one in math, and you also got a Master of Science also in electrical engineering and computer science. And I also know you have been involved in education and developing software for children for a long time. I'm now an undergraduate at MIT, also majoring in the same thing. So I'm curious if you could go into more detail on your journey at MIT and its influence on you, and how you decided on your majors, how you came to explore this aspect of developing software for children.
Yeah, for me, and I don't think it's necessarily particular to MIT, and I can only speak on my own college experience, or yours as well. But for me, I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, single parent. I went to it was I would call it a pretty normal high school for Louisiana. And I remember most people, when I was growing up in Louisiana, didn't even know necessarily where MIT was. And I remember when I was 7 years old, one of my uncles, who was in his 20s at the time, was doing his math homework at the University of New Orleans. And I was like, what is this? He says, it's calculus. I was like, can you teach me calculus? And he's like, no, you're too young for that. I was like, why do you need to learn calculus? He's like, because I'm studying to become an engineer. And I said, what does an engineer do? And he says, well, everything you see around you is made or designed by an engineer. For anything you, and then I said, well, then I want to become an engineer. And he said, and he does not remember this, but he said, well, if you want to become an engineer, you should go to MIT. That was just something he said in like 1982 to me, and didn't remember it. And then I said, I'll go to MIT. I didn't know what it stood for or anything. And that just kind of stood in my head. And I remember when I went to high school, I kept kind of repeating, and by that point I knew where it was, and I had to get serious about my studies because I knew it was not something you could just walk into. And so I had all of these like dreams of what it would be like when I went to college, that it would be like Hogwarts, that, you know, technology really is on some level the closest thing to magic, right? All the difference is if you don't understand it, you call it magic. If you understand it, you call it technology. And I have to say, to a large degree, when I went, that's what it felt like. It felt like, you know, there's all these exotic and mysterious things happening down every corridor. I think regardless of where you go to college, to be able to be surrounded by other people who stimulate you, who push you, to meet either fellow students or graduate students or professors who are trying to do big things, who aren't trying to shy away from it, I think is really inspiring. And you know, going back to the story of Khan Academy, for me to have somewhat delusional ambitions around it, I think I had to be exposed to other people who had somewhat delusional ambitions, and every now and then they succeeded. And so why not try?
Yeah, no, that as someone who is also currently at MIT right now, everything you're saying is 100% true. So yeah. I kind of want to change tack a little bit and talk about the pandemic, the ever-present pandemic. You know, I myself have used your videos extensively. You know, for some specifics, I found the SAT prep resources really helpful. All of the AP course content. I took quite a few AP exams during the pandemic, so obviously we were at home, but Khan Academy really well replicated the environment of a traditional classroom lecture. I also know you have Schoolhouse now for peer-to-peer tutoring, and you also have an in-person school called the Khan Lab School. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on how the pandemic has affected education around the world, and you know, how you and the Khan Academy team have responded? And also, you know, now that we've slowly started to emerge from the pandemic, how do you see these projects of yours evolving?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the jury is still out. You know, we realized that Khan Academy would have a somewhat unique role actually it was February of 2020, we got an email from a teacher in South Korea saying that he was using Khan Academy to keep his classroom learning through their nationwide physical school closures. And at that time, all of us in the US, we actually had no idea. We knew that there was something going on in Asia, but it wasn't even reported on the news that whole countries were already shutting down their school systems. And so that was the first time I caught wind of it. I was like, wow, one, South Korea has shut down their schools physically because of this thing. Mm-hmm. And two, wow, yeah, we would be really useful for something like this because we can be used in a school setting, we could be used independently by families, we cover a lot of subjects and grades, et cetera, et cetera. And then I remember, it was like probably a week or two later, many of y'all remember Santa Clara County, where we are right now, was one of the first places in the US to have community spread. Mm-hmm. I helped start a school called Khan Lab School, which is literally 2 miles up shoreline from where we are right now. And so being the chair of that school, we started saying, well, you know, what if we have to do what South Korea does? And at the same time, I started talking to the Khan Academy team and saying, well, gee, a lot of people might lean on us. We have to start stress testing our servers. You know, imagine in just the most extreme scenario, we had 3 times the usage. And it was literally, that was like a Thursday. Then Friday, we started getting murmurs that I think California had announced that it was going to shut down as of Monday. I think it was like Friday afternoon, California had announced it. Yeah. And we're like, oh, this is really happening. And by the next Friday, our learning minutes, you saw that slide, on an average school day, we have about 25 to 30 million learning minutes per day on Khan Academy. By the end of that week, it was 85 million. So it had done exactly 3x. So we were just trying to keep up with the demand. It was funny because a lot of people forget, at that first school closures, a lot of people were thinking, oh, this will just be through spring break. Like a lot of people thought it was very, very temporary. But it was pretty clear if you look at the epidemiology of it all, it's definitely going to happen through the end of the school year and maybe longer. So we were just trying to plan for those eventualities. And then as this has become more protracted than any of us have ever expected, we've just been trying to figure out how can we help the reconstruction happening. And this is a natural disaster of sorts. My family grew up in New Orleans. We experienced Katrina. There, it's very clear that a natural disaster has occurred. There's like boats on sidewalks, and there's houses that have been washed away and things like that. And so it's very visceral. So people want to do something about it. But the data is also clear in our school system. First of all, there was already a lot of learning loss pre-pandemic. Yeah. My least favorite stat, which is also the one I say the most, which is in the US, 65% of all kids who go to four-year colleges. So these are the kids who graduate, who go to college. So for the most part, top half of in a lot of cases, a lot of students, 65% of them have to remediate. They don't even get placed into college algebra. They have to remediate at essentially a pre-algebra level. So even though they're taking these classes called Algebra 1, Algebra 2, Geometry, sometimes pre-calculus, calculus, they have to go back and remediate because they have so many gaps in their knowledge. So that was before, and a lot of Khan Academy's ethos was, well, let's let students learn at their own time and pace and always have the opportunity to fill in any gaps that they might have. But then the data from the pandemic, it's gotten even worse. By a lot of estimates, especially in math, 10 to 30% worse kids are performing last year, and now it's getting into a protracted one. And those are even the kids that we've been able to assess. A lot of kids have just fallen off of the radar. No one even knows exactly how they're performing. So a lot of what we're focused on right now is how do we help, and it's not going to happen overnight, but in the next 5 years, 10 years, how do we make sure that this damage that's done is mitigated and hopefully filled in? We just had some efficacy studies, and there's been over 50 on Khan Academy, and they consistently show if kids are able to put in 30 minutes a week on average for, let's say, a year, they're growing 50 to 100% more than expected. And on one level, you're like, oh, that's magic. But on another level, it's not surprising because, once again, we're allowing them to fill in their gaps. We're allowing them to learn at their own pace. If they're ready to move ahead, they can move ahead and have a strong foundation. They're getting more problems in their zone of proximal development and their learning edge, so to speak. So that's kind of that's one area that we're really focused right now, and we're working with school districts to do that. Another area, you mentioned schoolhouse.world. When the pandemic was just getting started, a lot of people were leaning on Khan Academy, but we said, is there a way to connect people person to person? And so there was always this utopian idea, what if we could give everyone free tutoring? And how do you give free tutoring? Well, what if you could leverage volunteership to give free tutoring? And so we created a prototype called schoolhouse.world. It worked. That first summer, several hundreds of people had really great outcomes from it. And so the next year we got some philanthropic support. And so now schoolhouse.world, right now it's running a pilot that has on the order of 10,000 students getting free SAT prep for the upcoming SAT, free homework help. The main thing is we just have to get the word out. And it's being staffed by, frankly, a lot of high school students like yourself a couple of years ago. Schools like MIT, University of Chicago are actually interested in seeing students' schoolhouse.world transcripts to say, hey, look, if you could be a tutor of calculus, that means not only do you, or physics or chemistry or biology, that means not only do you know the material, but you can communicate, you have empathy, you have patience. Those are the students you want to bring to your campus, and I'm trying to convince people also give internships to. But I could go on, but those are kind of two of the big things that we really started going on during the pandemic.
All right. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I just wanted to thank you again for sitting down with me, for answering my questions. Yeah.
Oh no, well, good luck. Good luck. I am curious about your machine learning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anahita.
Thank you.
Fabulous. So we're going to continue our conversation now, turning to topics about entrepreneurship and tech for good. And we're thrilled to have Paul Sappho, who will be our moderator through the rest of the program. Many of you know Paul, but I especially appreciate his thoughtful voice on technology, kind of long-term technology change, and his impact on business and society. He advises corporate and government clients around the world and teaches at Stanford, that other university. And he's a fellow at the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences, a Forum Fellow at the World Economic Forum, and serves on many boards. He's also a long-term friend of CHM, and it's been a great pleasure to have him serve as chair of the selection committee for the Patrick J. McGovern Tech for Humanity Prize. So let's give a warm welcome now to Paul.
So by spring of 2010, I was at a low point, as I talked about. We were digging into savings. I was getting a few $100s of donations through PayPal from just random people around the world. If anyone watching, if there's any of them, thank you. But it was hard. And then all of a sudden a $10,000 donation came in. And I immediately see who it is. Her name is Ann Doer. I see she's local. She's based in Palo Alto. I immediately email Ann. I say, thank you so much for this incredibly generous donation. This is the largest donation that Khan Academy has ever received. If we were a physical school, you would now have a building named after you. And Ann immediately responds back. She says, well, I love what you're doing. I use it with my daughters. I even use it myself. And she's like, I see that you're local. I'd love to buy you lunch sometime. And so 3 or 4 days later, we're at an Indian restaurant off of University Ave in downtown Palo Alto. And Ann asks me over lunch, so what's your goal here? And I told her, free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. That's the mission statement. And she said, well, that's ambitious. How do you see yourself doing that? And I said, well, you're already familiar, Ann, with a lot of the content, the videos, the software. I showed her the screenshots of everything I was working on, even the teacher tools. I said, I wanted to see this used in classrooms. I said, one day we could cover all the core academic material. We could translate this into the languages of the world. And I had a notebook of testimonials that I was getting from folks. And I showed her how it was growing exponentially in terms of usage. And Ann said, well, you're making a surprising amount of progress. I only have quite one question. How are you supporting yourself? And in as proud of a way as possible, I said, I'm not. And then she kind of processes that a bit. She pays the bill. I drive home to my house in Mountain View, about 10, 15 minutes away. And while I'm driving into my driveway, I get a text message from Ann. And it says, you really need to be supporting yourself. I've just wired you $100,000.
So where'd you have lunch?
I forgot what the restaurant. It was right off of University Ave in 2010. I forgot what it was called. It might have been Nirvana. Someone said, yeah, it might have been there.
So I actually asked that for a serious reason, and that is, how important is place? If you had not been in Silicon Valley.
Oh, I think it's very important. I have this theory that I sometimes share with the team at Khan Academy and other stakeholders that it feels like benevolent aliens are using Khan Academy to prepare humanity for first contact. And the reason why I say that is...
Show of hands if that's a good thing.
That's theories about the virus too. They might reprogram us in certain ways to anyway. But But I say that because there have been so many events that would have turned out different if a butterfly flapped its wings in South America slightly different. Silicon Valley is interesting. It's kind of like I don't want to. I remember I first came out here. It's funny. Right after college, I didn't want to leave Boston. All my friends were there, but it was 1998, first .com bubble, and I got a good job offer and I had a lot of debt. So I said, let me come out here. I worked at Oracle. Then when the NASDAQ burst, I said, well, maybe I'll go to business school to take some shelter from the economy. And I wanted to go back to Boston. It's a wonderful place with a lot of students. So I go back to Boston, and that's where I work at a hedge fund. And a year into my hedge fund job, my boss, it was just me and my boss, he's a portfolio manager, his wife wants to become a lawyer. She was a lawyer. She wanted to become a professor of law. And essentially, wherever she would get her professorship would dictate wherever we moved the firm. And the finalists were UT Austin, UVA, and Stanford. And so for a little while, we thought we were going to move to Charlottesville. And
she became a professor at Stanford
But she
Law?
decided to take the Stanford Law job. And that's what moved Wohl Capital Management, me, Dan, and the firm, out here.
So next time any of you are annoyed at your lawyer, just remember, but for a lawyer.
Exactly. And Dan, I could go on about, Dan was very supportive about this tutoring
So do you think
project.
place still matters as much today in Silicon Valley as then? Should a bright young graduate from MIT start here in Silicon Valley instead of Boston?
I don't know. I don't know if it's the only place, but I think it is. And Boston is definitely, people can list Boston, New York, Austin, other places. But there is definitely probably a higher probability of being able to meet this as a not-for-profit world, meet a philanthropist like Ann Doer or other philanthropists that might come through the area in the Bay Area, and who view, even though Khan Academy is a story of not-for-profits and philanthropy. It's a certain way of thinking about impact and scale. I've seen in most of the world, in the East Coast even, a lot of the philanthropy is more your traditional bricks and mortar philanthropy. It's, let's sponsor the ballet, let's sponsor a charter school, and these are all great things. We need that type of philanthropy. But I think people out here are always thinking about, hey, let's take a bet on something that might sound a little crazy, a little bit delusional, and could scale.
Sure. Well, and I always think of Annalise Saxenian's famous observation that Silicon Valley is not spread out. It's packed tightly together, and everybody bumps into everyone. There was a point once upon a time when LA had more software programmers than Silicon Valley, but they never started companies because they were all stuck in the freeway sitting alone in their cars. Let's run the second video here.
Everyone looked at my resume, looked at my background, and says, hey, you should be an entrepreneur. You should start a tech company, or you should go work in a venture capital firm or something like that. And I was like, no, I don't have what it takes. I don't have the fortitude for it. And then when I started tutoring my cousins, people were like, what kind of a project is this? This is a business. What's your business plan? I was like, no, it's not a business. It's just my hobby. I'm just helping my cousins. And I would tell Sal, you're not an entrepreneur because you do not want to you go through what you went through in the late 90s. But then one thing led to another, and I started writing software. I still told myself, I am not an entrepreneur. And at some point, I did think it was going to become something big. But I was protecting it from some of the, I would say, psychological harmful things that can sometimes happen with entrepreneurship, where people immediately start thinking, oh, how are we going to divvy up the shares? How are we going to do this? Are you doing more work than I'm doing? Or, vice versa. Or, all the naysayers saying, wait, how are you going to make money off of this? This makes no sense. Someone tried to do the same thing 5 years ago. Every entrepreneur has heard all of these things, and you have to figure out some way to protect it from these things. But slowly but surely, it became something. And by 2009, I realized that my gut, my persona, my everything, no matter how much I tried to deny, I was like, I guess I'm an entrepreneur, and I need to do this.
Let's talk about failure. But first, just remind people, I've gotten the first set of questions. As you're thinking of questions, send them up for our last section, so I have them here. And Saul has promised if we don't get to all of them, he's going to take them home as his homework assignment and answer them all. So in Silicon Valley, we put kind of a gauzy light on entrepreneurship and success, and yet you were a reluctant entrepreneur, and I'm guessing that was because you had a prior failure?
Oh, many. But the most notable one is I was at the ripe age of 22, I was the CTO in 1999 of a startup. It was called MeVC. We were going to democratize venture capital. They had two founders who came from the investment banking world, and then I was one of their early hires as kind of the tech guy. There's a whole tech angle to it. And it was actually it was riding the zeitgeist of the time. How do people get into pre-IPO shares, et cetera, et cetera. And it was doing well. It even raised its first fund. But then, when the NASDAQ collapsed, I saw, well, even on the way up, I saw some of the distortions that played into it and the motivations. And then especially on the way down, how emotionally taxing and sometimes ugly things got. And
Firing people is painful.
Firing people, or even having to weigh in on who gets fired, or finger pointing or whatever it happens. And even on the way up, there's a little bit of like, who's getting what shares.
So let's talk about that. I mean, you're sitting here because you were a success, and yet Silicon Valley is built on failure. And where I think about it, here we are 3 miles from the San Andreas Fault. And the very good news is that earthquakes follow a Pareto 1 type pattern. The Gutenberg-Richter law is we have lots of small quakes and only small big quakes, and we have, as I recall, 10,000 magnitude 4s a year on the planet, but only 1 magnitude 8. Startup companies are the same way. You were a magnitude 7 or 8, and we only get a very few number of those, and then we get all those other ones. In this age of the internet and teaching tools like Khan Academy, can we change that ratio? Can we make it less grim and Darwinian?
Good question. I've never had that before. For me, I think there might be a way. The strategy in hindsight that I took was one that was probably a little bit more fault tolerant in certain ways. because
That was because of your prior experience?
to a certain degree because of my prior experience. I'm now find myself 2004, 2005 working as an analyst at a hedge fund. I enjoyed that job. It was remunerative. And I've kind of was telling myself, well, if I do well here eventually, I could start a school on my own terms. That was always one of my dreams, to be kind of like a Dumbledore type figure. Or I could.
Oh, wait, that's an amazing prediction, because you were a Dumbledore figure before.
Oh,
Actually, Harry Potter was out. That's right, okay.
Oh, yeah. And I didn't imagine Dumbledore before J.K. Rowling. That would have been mind-blowing if I would have been.
Just getting the causality here.
But I think the good thing is, once I saw that there was something here, when my cousins were getting value out of it, and people who were not my cousins were benefiting from it, and this was the software I was making for them, the videos, I was convinced at that point that this, even if it only benefits my cousins and the few thousand people who are using it at the time, that is a project worth doing while I have my other job. But I just kept working on it for 3, 4, 5 years. And I also saw that a lot of, I think we get obsessed with the good idea.
But let me make you pause right there, because we talk about velocity in the valley. And yet what I'm hearing you say is it needed time to cook.
It needed time to cook for me to understand what it is, for me to understand what I wanted it to be. And it also needed that time to some degree to get traction. A lot of people, as they say, most overnight successes were made over like 15 years. And so there was a 5-year period between me tutoring Nadia, my cousin, and 2009 when I quit my day job. And then there was another year to get to that Andover moment. So that was 6 years. And I had told myself, if I don't make it work in this first year, we were living off of savings, I would go back to work, but I would keep working on the project.
So then, if instead of calling you up and telling you she was going to deposit $100,000, Anne spoke to her spouse, and he called you up and said, I'm giving you $10 million, would you have failed?
I don't know. I didn't have that decision to make, but there were several other VCs at the time, pre-Anne, who came up and they were ready to write kind of the angel investment check. They were going to write the $100,000, said you quit your day job and then you keep working on it, et cetera, et cetera. And it was tempting. I took the meetings, but the second meeting or third meeting, they weren't saying anything wrong, but it didn't feel right for what this was going to be. So the second meeting was always, how are you going to monetize this? Okay, this stuff we'll give free, but what's the freemium stuff? And that started to feel, there's nothing wrong with that. There's legitimate, a lot of innovation happens through that, but for this dream, this Asimovian dream, it didn't seem right.
As an entrepreneur, you had a fine education, you had all the right, look at it, and it's like the lords of serendipity, that all the pieces fell in place. But it sounds like at the end of the day, it was intuition. To walk away from a venture capitalist takes discipline and intuition. How important has intuition been to your entrepreneurship?
Super important. I think intuition and a little bit of just close observation or introspection on what really makes you happy. And I realized that trying to, figure out how much money you might one day get and all of that, I've gotten into that game before. But at the end of the day, did it really, and there's nothing wrong with that, but for me, it didn't really make me happy. Even at the hedge fund. I worked at a hedge fund, the most for-profit thing anyone could.
Money was not enough. You were determined to corrupt youth.
Exactly. Well, it was the intellectual, for me, even at the hedge fund job, it was really more the intellectual challenge of it that I found interesting more than, the bonus day was kind of anticlimactic in a lot of ways. And, when I started getting so much joy out of this project, and before I quit my day job, I did some real deep soul searching, and I said, look, if I could set this up in a way that I could do exactly what I'm doing all the time, help make content, create it into a not-for-profit that actually had a shot at this grandiose mission, and I told myself if I could make enough money to have a middle-class house in Mountain View, which even in 2010 was not a joke, but to have a Honda Odyssey and take my family on vacations and be able to pay for college, I'm happy. That's all if I get to do that and I get to work on exactly what I think, how I might be able to make a dent in the universe with other people who want to make a similar dent in the universe, I didn't see any, more fun way to live your life.
Brilliant. I think you answered the question of why one does entrepreneurship in the face of the horrendous odds is you follow your passion and you do what makes you happy and you don't think you're swinging for the fences. Let's shoot our next video here.
My junior year, I got a fellowship called the Eloranta Fellowship to write math software for students who have ADHD. And this was for K-12 students. And I didn't realize it at the time, of course, but very similar ideas back then to what Khan Academy later became. What if we gave people as much practice as they need, gamify things, instant feedback, ways to get nudges if you're having trouble with something. And then obviously, again, when my cousins need help, I immediately said, hey, maybe I can write software. Well, 2006, a friend suggested that I actually scale my lessons by making videos. I thought it was a silly idea. I told him YouTube is for cats playing piano, not serious math. Got over the idea that it was not my idea. Gave that a shot. And that took on a life of its own because the videos were there. They were on YouTube. They were public. The internet was here. The internet is great about disseminating information, for sure, and also disseminating interactivity and also connecting people in ways that we could have never imagined even 20 or 30 years ago. So there's going to be educational institutions on the internet one day. I didn't know if it was going to be 50 years or 100 years or 5 years. But I thought, well, this nascent project that I was doing with my family, why couldn't this have a shot of being something that could be what the Oxfords or the Harvards are, but actually on a scale times 1,000 or on a scale times 1,000,000 or on a scale times 1,000,000,000 people being able to reach it. And there's no strong intellectual argument why it couldn't happen other than the fact that it sounded kind of outlandish.
So, student zero, as I recall, is your cousin Nadia. How's she doing?
Yeah, I tell her there's a lot riding on her success.
Yeah, I know. We want to know. Is she MIT postdoc now?
She is in the PhD program at the New School in New York in clinical psychology. So she's doing just fine.
Very nice. Who here knows the New School or went to the New School? Wait, keep your hand up, sir. There's exactly one hand here. Oh, two. Oh, that was a camera. Look it up afterwards. It is an extraordinary institution.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the thing that intrigues me the most about the many intriguing things of Khan is the scaling. And I think back, it was H.G. Wells a little over 100 years ago who said, civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. And at moments it feels like you're doing more on the education front than any of the universities. Do you ever have that sense that maybe Khan is having a bigger impact than, say, the small technical college in Boston that starts with an M?
Yeah, I think everyone has kind of their place in the universe and the ecosystems. And I think the great universities, they obviously do incredible research, and then they create context for not that many people to have a great experience on a lot of levels, hopefully a great experience. But I do think, even when I met Anne back in 2010 at the Indian buffet, even then I did the back of the envelope. Khan Academy was already, I believe the number was, reaching more people. Well, I think it had already reached more people than Harvard had in its history at that point. And we've grown us by a factor of 100 or 1,000 since then. And so it was pretty clear that the scale was there. And obviously Khan Academy is not the first thing we have so many other platforms that have scaled. But I think we're one of the first organizations to maybe perceive ourselves as an institution that can exist on the internet, that needs to exist on the internet. That, there's all these other metaphors between the physical world and the virtual world. You have commerce, you have e-commerce, you have whatever you want to call it. You have in-person networking, you have social networking. But there are what are the libraries, the museums, the schools of the internet? Wikipedia, I think, has set up it's hard for us to imagine a world without Wikipedia.
And I think of Wikipedia as the closest kindred spirit to Khan in cyberspace. Is that an accurate statement?
I think in a lot of ways. And when I talked about inspirations for Khan Academy, I'd have to cite Wikipedia as another one because they showed that Jimmy Wales could have tried to monetize Wikipedia a lot more aggressively. But he made a decision that, no, this is an institution that needs to exist for the world. And imagine if he didn't do that, we'd still be in this world where there'd be these, the equivalent of
that's an
Encarta or whatever else.
If he had done that, it wouldn't have scaled. It would have eventually fizzled out.
It wouldn't have scaled, and Wikipedia is fueled by other people's goodwill. I mean, there's people who are devoting hours and hours of their labor to this project. If it wasn't a not-for-profit as an institution for the world, it would have just been, at the time, the big online encyclopedia was Microsoft Encarta, which cost $200 or $300. Very few people had access to it. And even though people have been skeptical of Wikipedia over the years, the accuracy is higher than any.
That's another dimension to what your moment in time and Wikipedia's moment. That it was a long time ago, and I think half of the people in this room were not born then. But when Amazon gasped, Jeff said, actually, ordinary people can have opinions about books and rate them. And I remember people at Encyclopedia Britannica saying, oh no, this Wikipedia, you can't, no. And Khan was swimming in that same ocean. Was it a moment in time when we really had a big shift of changing how we thought about expertise?
Yeah, and we were a little bit of a strange beast because everyone in Silicon Valley thinks about platforms. So Wikipedia is a platform. A lot of these companies are platforms. People in Silicon Valley tend to not think too much about content or brand because they don't think that scales. And we were a little bit of a hybrid between a platform on one level, but on another level, we realized that one of the things we wanted to protect was the sense that Khan Academies, when you go there, there'd be a certain ethos, there'd be a certain trust, there'd be a certain whimsy to it, a certain lack of stress, some humor and all of that. So we also realized in the middle of Silicon Valley that we're actually creating a bit of a media company. So it's kind of Wikipedia on one dimension, Sesame Street on another. Sesame Street, the Children's Television Workshop, had a very utopian idea in the 70s. Like, hey, let's use this scalable distribution mechanism called public television to educate a generation of children. And it has made a dent in all of our lives. But what if we can now use these new platforms, new scales, but have an ethos like a Sesame Street? If you think about it, in education, outside of the elite universities, which they do have a brand, but their brands are more around selectivity.
If Kurt Gödel had watched Sesame Street, he would have made Khan Academy.
Potentially, exactly. And there's an opportunity. If you think about the education space, there's very few kind of trusted brands. Yeah, you have your Stanfords, your Harvards, but that's around selectivity. But around are there institutions that people trust? Sesame Street was one of them. And it kind of was using scalable technology, and I think that was another model for us.
And the other thing I find remarkable about what you did was education was the toss-away application for every medium of the 20th century when people couldn't figure out what the medium was good for. Radio was going to educate us, and TV was going to be the high school of the air. And when I was at Harvard, one of my professors, Tony Ottinger, wrote a book, Run, Computer, Run, explaining why education, was just a dumb default. It was drill and practice and the like. You completely changed that model, and of course there were antecedents, but it all came together at Khan in a way it didn't come together anywhere else. Was it the moment in time? Was it the availability of the internet? Which, of all the pieces that are floating around loose in there, what was critical?
I think the moment in time for sure. I think the existence, as I said, Khan Academy, and I always emphasize this because people associate us so much with the videos. I always say most of our resources are actually on the interactive platform and other things, but the fact that YouTube existed at that time and that on-demand video, hosting it, sharing it, making it discoverable, in that 2004, 2005 timeframe, that's when it started. And I wasn't the first person to create education videos on YouTube, but I think the combination of having a platform like that, plus I think just...
You were the first person I mean, what you did scaled and took off.
I think there was a combination of, I get a little bit of obsessive once I start something. So I was starting to crank out, 5, 6 videos a day. You can imagine that turns into thousands of videos.
You just wanted that minivan.
I wanted the minivan. and it's, I think there's a lot of people don't think content scales, but there was a realization that, but academic content scales and is very evergreen. I joked in the,
okay, so let's talk about scale. So someone who is no longer with us, but sat in this very room on occasion, was Doug Engelbart. And all of Doug's work, the Augment Project, to rephrase what he was doing, is basically he looked at the world and said, we're in a race between two exponentials. We have the exponential opportunities like Moore's Law that we all see, but we also have those exponential challenges. And the way to close the gap as the opportunities are chasing the challenges, his idea was to augment human intellect, to build the tools that would help us make us smarter and more capable. And the good news, in my opinion, is Khan Academy comes closer to Doug's vision than anything I've seen. The bad news is that Khan Academy is still the example that comes closest. That you all have done an amazing job of scaling. You've inspired some folks to do other things, like at Stanford, Coursera was inspired in part by Khan Academy. Why aren't we seeing more scaling?
It's a good question. I think there's just a lot of inertia in the system. I think the...
Okay, let me rephrase it.
Yeah.
How would you make more scaling happen? You've done it once, no pressure. I'm not going to give you $10 million because that's not a good thing. Yeah. I'll give you, inflation, $200,000 in as much time as you want. How do we crack this gap between exponential challenges and exponential opportunities?
Well, I'll give you an example. Schoolhouse.world is an example of something that started in the last year and a half on a budget a little bit bigger than that. It has about $1 million a year budget, which has a really good chance of cracking free tutoring. It's already scaling up. It's going to give tutoring to 10,000 students this month. SAT tutoring, 8 sessions, the market value, that's probably $1,000. That's $10 million of value just in that 1 month for a budget of 1 million. And that can scale. It can scale to 10 million students eventually, which would have 10 billion of market impact value. So I think models like that. But if I could wave my wand, I would go to the government level and say, change our architecture of our system to be less seat time based. You set 4 years of math, this, that, sit 4 years at a college, and make it more competency based, and have very clear ways of proving that competency. Khan Academy could be one of them, and we have ways of doing that. And then that would unlock a whole ecosystem where everyone just says, I just have to prove my competency in these things, and it unlocks jobs, it unlocks opportunities in higher education. And if that happened, then the whole system, including the public education system, would be all about preparing you for those competencies.
So something that just occurred to me. I think of secondary schools as feeders for what you do next in life, and I think about that a lot. My kindergarten teacher wanted to hold me back. There was some question about getting out of 3rd grade and 7th grade. And my father, who went to Yale, said, this is why I ended up at Harvard. We have this linear process, and Khan Academy has given a big boost to a piece of it. Is the future something that is radically different, maybe non-linear?
Yeah, I think it's going to exist in parallel. And what I tell the team at Khan Academy all the time is we're going to serve the system as it is today and help raise the ceiling if you have a classroom.
And what's the part after that?
Well, can we also raise the floor? Can we be like the safety net for the world's education system on some level, where ideally it's in conjunction with a physical classroom, and ideally those physical classrooms look a lot more like our lab school, where kids can learn at their own pace, they interact more collaborative. But if you don't have access to a school, you don't have access to rigorous material, you can go on Khan Academy.
So what about Khan University?
So I'll tell you a potential path that gets there. So we going back to the college algebra problem, where most kids don't even place into college algebra, even though college algebra really is algebra 2, should happen in 10th or 11th grade. We did a pilot this last semester with Howard University. We went into Title I high schools, with kids, and not all the kids in the Title I high schools, not just creaming a few of them, and saying, okay, we have this course on Khan Academy. If you get mastery in this, you will get transferable college algebra credit from Howard University. And we're still tabulating the results, but it looks like a lot of these kids, and if left to their own devices, 90% of these kids wouldn't even place into college algebra. Even if they went into college, they would have ended up taking remedial math. Most of them are going to get college algebra credit. And if they don't finish by the end of the course, they can keep working on it eventually so they get college algebra credit. But if it works for college algebra, well, why not for calculus, for statistics, for biology, chemistry, physics, history, writing? We have some interesting ways that we can prove what someone writes and develops it. And I'll tell you, and if you really, why not the first 2 years of college could be done that way, for free, at your own time and pace, with supports, mastery base. And I'll also say, if you have truly mastered the first 2 years of college, truly mastered it, you are more educated than most college graduates. Because most college graduates have sat in classes for 4 years, but they don't even remember what classes they took. The number of times I've walked into, I meet a friend who works in biotech, and I ask them what they do, and they're like, oh, we're working on this compound called NADH. I'm like, oh yeah, from the Krebs cycle. They're like, how do you know that? And I'm like, it's freshman biology. There's such a low expectation of retention. If people actually mastered your freshman chemistry, physics, biology, maybe your sophomore level organic chemistry. I mean, imagine someone who actually retained their organic chemistry. Imagine someone who retained their sophomore level classes. And the humanities, if you actually know freshman level world history well, or American history, or literature well, sure, you are a very, very educated person. And that should be the bar. And if that's free and available, yeah, you can go to a university and throw frisbees on the quad, and that's a great experience. But you also have this other path, maybe in addition to, if people don't think that your GPA from a university is carrying a lot of weight, or if you didn't have access to a university.
I love it. We should do some questions. So I have an impossible number of these. I'm actually going to randomly
I'll try to go fast. I know I get wordy.
But I'll open with this obvious first question. It's just wonderful. What was the most favorite video you ever made or was made at Khan Academy? I know all your children are beautiful, but
yes,
pick one.
I'll tell you the one that for me, it makes me seem very learned when the research for this video, and I made a video on it because I thought it was so cool, and some of y'all probably know this, but it was mind-blowing to me. So I was doing a video on kind of ancient India and the Vedas, and so it turns out that in the Rig Veda, arguably 4,000-year-old Indian scripture, kind of the core of Hinduism, the most mentioned god is Indra, who's kind of a god of sky, and his fathers, and depending on which source you look at, there's different fathers for Indra, but in the Rig Veda, Indra's father is referred to as Sky Father, and in Sanskrit, Sky Father is Jos Pater, Jupiter, Zeus Pater. So the fact that the 4,000-year-old Indian text has Jupiter/Zeus in it, it gives me chills. It's, the fact that the world is connected in this very, very profound way. So that might have been one of my, and I love, anytime there's a lull in conversation at a party, I'm like, did you know in the Vedas?
Right. Yes. By the way, it's a really nice new translation out.
Oh, really?
Yeah. God, that's wonderful. I didn't know that story. But yeah, I mean, people think that back then nobody got around.
No.
And
these Proto-Indo-Europeans clearly did.
They tried. Well, they didn't have email to answer, so they had time to take trips. This is absolutely impossible.
And there's a video on that one, because you asked favorite video. That's why I said that.
Yeah, I love it. So do you remember the title of the video?
I'm sure if you look up, Khan Academy and Vedas or something, you'll find it.
Okay. What made you create short videos instead of longer courses?
I remember the first video I tried to upload on YouTube was 11 minutes and it got rejected. And so the next one was 9. And YouTube, now YouTube doesn't have a time limit on it, but back then they did, and it was a blessing. At first you're like, oh, how can you cover all of calculus in 10-minute snippets? But then you're like, oh no, you could. And it's actually, there's very natural breakpoints, and if anything, we're pushing ourselves to try to do it in 3 to 5 minutes. You just do more videos, but it creates these very natural breakpoints, and it actually makes it very interactive. Because some people would say videos are passive, but when they're bite-sized like that, the act of saying, hey, I want to learn about the connections between the Greek and Roman religions and the Vedas. Oh, there's a 3-minute video on that. It becomes a much more active process.
You know, it's interesting you say it, because as someone who teaches for a living, there have been times I've watched the video and I go, that was great, it ended too soon.
Yeah.
And it makes you think. So
Yeah.
you're right. So some students feel too overwhelmed / hopeless / intimidated to search for online resources. How do you reach these students?
Yeah, I think that's the key. You know, Khan Academy, the existence of it, hopefully we make it easier to access, more engaging, so more and more kids could just take it and run with it. But we still know it's a minority of students who could just race ahead. And I think later today we're going to meet some of the super users of Khan Academy. That's why it's so important to be using it in conjunction with a classroom. This is why we are so focused right now on working with school districts, because if we can become more part of the formal system, we're more likely to reach more students, and then they'll have the supports of their peers and their teachers around them. So it's not Khan Academy only. It should hopefully be part of an ecosystem. But if you only have Khan Academy, we do hope that even that becomes a lot easier to improve yourself than anything that maybe has existed before.
This is a question more or less from the Vedas.
Okay.
I wasn't going to ask it, but it's so good, and the question kind of puzzles me. How do you balance delusion and reality, especially in the context of building a nonprofit rather than a for-profit?
Yeah, well, I think the delusion and reality, whether you're doing not-for-profit or for-profit, is a very interesting tension, because you can have these grandiose thoughts, but then you have to say, well, what's going to be the next step to take? And
so you need enough delusion to break the rules?
You need to take a step back every now and then and dream and think about, well, why can't it be this big thing? But then you have to come back to ground, get grounded and say, well, what's the next best step? And I actually I'll take it back to the Gita, and the Vedas to some degree. In Vedic philosophy, since we're there, there's this notion, the rajas, that everything in the universe in reality has one of 3 aspects. There's a truthful aspect, which is sattvic. There's a kind of motivated by energy and ambition, which is rajasic. And then there's a chaotic aspect or a slovenly aspect, which is tamasic. And most of us are motivated most of the time by rajasic things. I'm going to do this because I'm going to get something. Or if I don't do this, I'm going to lose something. You're motivated by outcome. While sattvic action, and it's actually very consistent with Stoic philosophy as well, is like, no, just figure out what the right thing to do is, and do it, see what the outcome is, accept the outcome, and then pick the next right thing to do. And so I think the big ambition, the delusional ambition, can kind of point you in a direction, but then say, okay, I don't know if I'm going to achieve that or we're going to achieve that or not, but at least let me take a step forward. Because sometimes when you get so obsessed with the outcome, you get paralyzed by even taking that first step.
So there's a passage in the Gita. I'm not going to do it justice, but it goes to the effect that the biggest block is, or the biggest obstacle is not the grand block in front of you, but the temptation to take the easier path. Talk about that in the context of your leadership style. I mean, you could have taken some much easier paths on all this.
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I think it's interesting. I mean, it goes back to me in denial of like, oh, I don't want to be an entrepreneur.
And I mean, and you know, the way you tell a story is sort of, well, I did, it's just kind of a natural thing, and I sort of know. But it looks like to me you spent your whole career resisting the easy path.
Yeah, I think there's a sense, I think a lot of young people have it, and Anahita probably, I'm sure, feels it, that like, okay, you got one life. What can you do with this life? You don't want to waste it. And I think you learn pretty early that the best path for you is probably the one of steepest gradient. Not always, but the one that's like, if there's an easier path, sometimes that makes sense. But like really make sure that you shouldn't be avoiding that that steep. But at the same time, I've also been a big believer that if it feels wrong, you also shouldn't be doing it. So
Right.
it goes back to if it feels like the right decision, and if you don't get paralyzed by obsessing with the outcome, then what seemed like a hard path doesn't seem as hard anymore.
I want to put 3 lines under that. You only have one life. You got to think hard about what you should be doing with it, because I think for a lot of people that doesn't occur to them until it's too late. Is part of Khan Academy sending that message to students?
I'm hoping that students will say like, hey, I have things in front of me that I can run with. So maybe I should. But obviously there's more to that. People have to meet people that can open their aperture, like I was able to get when I was in college. And I had other mentors throughout my career. But yeah, I hope, another model I have is imagine if, we're getting very philosophical here, but regardless of whether you believe in reincarnation, imagine that you do get reincarnated, and you're going to be reincarnated some random place in the world. You're not likely to be reincarnated in Mountain View, California. It's going to be someplace else.
Where you can afford a house.
What can you selfishly do in this life to most benefit your next incarnation? And just make that your true north. And you'll probably do reasonable things. Because I think selfishly, if, maybe there's oblivion, maybe there's some kind of an afterlife, who knows? But if there's, I'm more likely to be born in some village in India or Africa or Latin America, if in 100 years that future person has at least access to Khan Academy, they might have a chance out. They won't be stuck.
So this is an insurance policy on your next.
Exactly. It's
of course,
very selfish motivation.
The Zen Buddhists would say that, if you pursue enlightenment with the expectation of a reward for enlightenment, it doesn't work.
No, exactly.
Right.
That's right.
I'd love to hear a little bit more advice. So I was talking with a close friend this weekend, and he just stepped down as the commanding officer of Top Gun out in Nevada. And I was talking about his path, and he said, well, one piece of advice is know that they're going to be in your life path people who will stand in front of you and say no. And you got to learn how to ignore them. And in his case, he had one of those, and he ignored them and went on to become head of Top Gun, and also had he said, well, my real accomplishment was being an extra in that movie. But, what are other pieces of advice you would give to, not just to students who use Khan Academy, but more generally?
We talked about these tensions, and we have a lot of tensions in our life. You have this tension between grandiose thinking and what's the next step to take. I think we all have tensions between thinking we're amazing, but then feeling imposter syndrome. We have tensions between doing what's pragmatic, how am I going to pay the bills, versus the standard follow your passion and do something big. And I think the answer is how can you maintain the tension without letting it get too far one way or the other? And what I tell a lot of folks who are just getting out of college is I thought it was very important for me to do some of these more pragmatic things, or work at a big tech company like Oracle, I was able to pay my bills, I was able to pay down my debt, I was able to save up money for a down payment, working at the hedge fund, so I was doing these very practical things. But at the same time, either because of intent or because of luck, I was always able to carve out something to tinker and to work on my passions. And I give a lot of credit to Dan, my boss, when I was at the hedge fund, because when I started there, I was ready to work 80 hours a week. I thought that's what you had to do at a hedge fund. And within the first few days, he's like, Sal, go home. And I said, Dan, all right, I'll go home and I'll work from there. He's like, no, I want you to go home and do other things, because our job as investors is to not just work ourselves silly. Our job is to make a few good decisions every year and avoid a bunch of bad ones. And the best way you can do that is to have an open aperture, to be refreshed, et cetera. That gave me the time and space when Nadia needed help to say, hey, I can tutor you. Hey, I have a little time. I could make some videos. I could write some software. So I'd recommend anyone, who's trying to figure out their life trajectory, see if you can have your cake and eat it too. If you start to lean heavily on the passion side, make sure that you have a backup option on the pragmatic side. But as you're leaning heavily on the pragmatic side, make sure that you haven't completely given up on the passion side.
What is your one passion that you engage in that has the least possible to do with Khan Academy?
The least possible, in some ways, a lot of, it's all kind of connected in some way. I like to play guitar. I've somewhat gotten addicted to the sauna recently. No, I'm not that good. But I enjoy it.
Do you use Khan Academy videos?
But I use YouTube for sure to learn to better myself in guitar. But no, I think the mental health and well-being is probably one of my passions now. But I think it has direct relation. I meditate. It's been transformational for me. Like, anytime you do anything entrepreneurial, or you can become very stressful. But then you're like, where does the stress come from? It's such a useless emotion, and it's usually your stress is coming because you're attached to some outcome. You're like, oh, if this doesn't happen, this is going to go, or this. But then when you start just living in the moment, accepting, just doing the next best thing, a lot of the stuff you were stressed about starts to resolve themselves. But even more, you just have more energy to just tackle things when they actually present themselves in the moment.
It's like that bumper sticker you see around the Bay Area, because we do have a lot of students in meditation, and it says, don't just do something, sit there. Exactly.
I've seen that if you don't have time to meditate for 10 minutes, it means you need to meditate for 20. So yes, I like that one too.
Yes. So we have just it's a big subject, and we have 3 minutes. And the question is, how do you see college education changing in the next 10 years? And do you think the way students approach college will change? But I have an addition to that.
Okay.
I would argue that Khan Academy is quietly subversive. And there is a whole generation now that has come to depend upon Khan Academy to get them through school, and come to depend upon a whole different way of educating without realizing that. They're now filtering into college. What will be the impact of the Khan generation on colleges and those unsuspecting professors? Will that transform college?
Oh, I think there's going to be two transformations that happen in parallel. One is the system as a whole. I think in 10 years, I hope Khan Academy is a major player here, but I hope it happens regardless of who does it. In 10 years, you're going to be able to prove what you know, prove that you are just as educated as any college graduate, and you're going to be able to prove it for free, and you're going to be able to prepare for it for free and get all the supports you need for free. So I think that's going to exist. It does not mean that college is going to go away, but it's going to put an interesting pressure on college to say, how do we add value through experiences that you're not able to get through these other things? I actually think one thing could be, hey, why don't we treat these freshmen more like graduate students? Have them do research, have them build things as opposed to sit in lecture halls. That's already happening. I think the tolerance of students to sit in lecture halls is very low.
I'm doing an independent study with a student this quarter who's a sophomore at Stanford. He took my class, which is an upper level class, last year as a freshman, and it was only because of Zoom and the pandemic that I didn't realize till halfway through the quarter he wasn't a graduate student. And the level of, it's inhuman. It's a reminder whenever I walk.
And so I think the universities that will thrive are the ones that either say, how do we support people to prove their competencies on these third-party benchmarks? Or when human beings get together on a beautiful campus at a Stanford, at a wherever, how do we optimize that experience? They've been squandering that experience for hundreds of years, making them sit in lecture halls. When all of us think about, when you ask the university what people are paying for, the university says, oh, we have this faculty and we're giving these lectures and all this. But when you ask what people loved about their college experience, it's all the stuff that happened on the margin. Oh, it was the late night conversations at the dorm and we talked philosophy. Well, why can't you make that the main course? And facilitate it, make people meet each other, talk about interesting things.
That socialization process. That's, to me, the big question hovering over all of this is all those informal conversations over pizza and the like. How do we do that? I got a stack more questions. You can do your homework.
I'll try.
But it's 5:47, so we should pause right here. And one word. You have one word for us?
Oh yeah, they told me to write it down ahead of time.
Good.
And
so we're going to close with a
okay.
question.
All right.
And this is part of the one word initiative at the
All
museum. And what is the one word of advice you would give to a young innovator or entrepreneur?
Yeah, I wrote it down. It's very consistent with everything we've been saying, and I feel very preachy today. You can call me Guru Sal, but I wrote meditate. So that's very preachy. I'm very preachy.
I like it. And Daniel, let's get you up on stage here.
Thanks, everyone. Please join me in thanking both Sal and Paul. Thank you. I always have the enviable task of trying to wrap up a program like this. So a couple things that I thought about over the course of this conversation. Sal made an initial comment about some things that more or less came out of Steve Jobs' mouth a long time ago about wheels for the mind. And I was looking at Paul's comments about Doug Engelbart and his notion that computing could help coalesce the human condition to solve the problems that we've created for ourselves. And I looked at the dates, and I noticed that Engelbart's mother of all demos, for those of you, some of you were probably there, was in 1968, which was 8 years before Sal was born and 8 years before Apple was founded. And 8 years after Apple was founded, the Macintosh launched. And there's at least one person in the room who was there with me. I got to be part of that. And for those who don't know, the first slide in the presentation that introduced the Macintosh to people for quite some time was a Cuisinart. And the question was, what do you want to do with it? And in some ways, when you think about what Silicon Valley was all about and the creation of computers as we know them today, what Sal's been doing with the Khan Academy is giving everyone on the planet a chance to reroute, just like what a GPS would do if you make a wrong turn, and you need to reroute and learn the better path. And it's available to everyone in the world for free at scale. And so thank you, Sal.
Thank you.
Great.
Appreciate it.